Hey folks, welcome back to RP Plus, RPU, RP Everything. Dr. Mike Israel here for Hypertrophy Concepts and Tools, Advanced Implications of SFR, lecture number 13. Let's take a look at what's on the agenda. The content slide is really big. You can read it in your own time if you want to pause the video. But basically what we're going to do is look at how the stimulus to fatigue ratio, which we've already defined in an earlier video and really explored how to calculate it and what it means. We're going to find out this time how it intersects and interplays with a bunch of other programming variables. Like, for example, reps in reserve. You could ask a question: how many reps in reserve per set leads to the best stimulus to fatigue ratio? That's a question we can ask, and today we'll answer it. What about exercise technique? How does it relate to SFR? What about exercise selection? We've already talked about some of these, some we have never talked about. For example, frequency, per session volume. All of these have answers as to which ones give you the best stimulus to fatigue ratios, not so great ones, and the worst ones to avoid. Let's dig in and really explore this super advanced, intricate concept. So first one is the relationship of the stimulus to fatigue ratio to reps in reserve. So essentially, what's the best stimulus to fatigue ratio we can get if we're asking the question of how close to failure should we go? All right. And it turns out that probably a good guess is about 2 reps in reserve on average gives you the best stimulus to fatigue ratios, the best SFRs. Why? Well, anything much easier than that, the magnitude of the fatigue probably isn't great. It isn't very high, so no worries. But the magnitude of the stimulus is so low that the stimulus to fatigue ratio ends up not being so great, right? On the other hand, you get the best stimulus possible, or close to it, if you go to failure and even a bit beyond failure, probably causes even more stimulus per set. So you could ask the question of, if the stimulus just goes up, the closer to failure we get and even beyond, why isn't SFR that great at failure and beyond? Well, the answer is the fatigue goes up too. And unfortunately, the fatigue goes up faster than the stimulus goes up. So while an RIR2 set is pretty stimulative and not so fatiguing, an RIR0 set is more stimulative by a small margin, but much more fatiguing. So that it turns out that the stimulus to fatigue ratio is not that great when we're pushing at failure or beyond. But since this is an advanced lecture, let's get into the nuances. So time for the super intricate discussion, because 2 RIR is a cool average, but we can do better than that. So it turns out at the beginning of a mesocycle, when you're very primed for growth, the sensitivity of your muscles to a stimulus is very high, which means we can get an absolutely high level of muscle growth stimulus with much less relative effort, proximity to failure, than we would have to normally in the middle of a mesocycle, let's say. So at the beginning of a mesocycle, you train just a little bit and thus get just a little bit fatigued, but you get an impressive amount of stimulus. Later on, you have to train harder and harder to actually get less and less stimulus, even though you keep trying to get as much as you can. And thus the fatigue cost starts to go up. So it turns out that at the beginning of the mesocycle, the best SFRs might actually be found at RIRs of 3 and maybe even 4. So at the beginning of the mesocycle, the best stimulus to fatigue ratio might actually be found with 3 or 4 RIR, which is maybe one of the reasons why we say it's a good idea to start there, right? On the other hand, we have to note something. We say, okay, if the SFR is the best at 3 or 4 to begin, why don't we just keep doing those types of RIRs and just finish the mesocycle at 3 or 4 RIR sets, just, do multiple, many sets to make up for it. Well, the problem is that we have a rising level of anabolic resistance throughout the entire mesocycle. You get very easy growth in the first microcycle. In the second microcycle, you have to do a bit more and train a bit harder to get the same level of growth, and so on and so forth. And notice, even if you manage to get the same level of growth every single microcycle of a meso, which we can probably get pretty close to doing, what is the fatigue doing at that point? Well, as the mesocycle, as the accumulation phase moves on, just cumulative fatigue rises every single time. And forget about cumulative fatigue. At any one point, If we're getting closer to failure, right, because we have to continue to present a challenge and we have to increase the load, so on and so forth, if we get closer to failure, whether it's by just chasing overload or by trying to outrun cumulative fatigue, we're going to end up summing greater and greater and greater acute fatigues to that cumulative. So not only is cumulative going like this, but acute fatigue adds to it every time, so it goes like that, which means, remember, SFR is stimulus divided by fatigue. If the stimulus is basically the same, but the fatigue goes like that, then SFRs decay every single microcycle. Your best stimulus to fatigue ratio is almost always found in your first microcycle of an accumulation, not in the second, certainly not in the fourth or fifth or sixth. That's when it's really, really, really bad. So huge point is that on an absolute level of, if you just calculate the raw number of SFR, stimulus to fatigue relationship, the absolute level of SFRs falls from microcycle 1 all the way until you have to deload. Usually you deload when the SFR has fallen so much that it's almost not even productive to keep training, right? So that's definitely a thing that absolutely happens. However, we can say, okay, that's a fact, and we can go back and recognize, okay, anabolic resistance is increasing every single microcycle, which means that if we continue to train at 3 or 4 RIR every single microcycle, at some point, the anabolic resistance is so high, our driver of stimulus at being 3 or 4 RIR is just not high enough to cause maybe almost any growth, or it starts to cause very little growth. Mind you, we got cumulative fatigue going. It's taking the denominator of SFR and jacking it up the entire time. But our numerator is falling unless we push it harder. So while SFR at an absolute level goes down throughout the accumulation phase, if we have to zoom in on any single microcycle and ask what is the optimal RIR to get the SFR as high as it could be relative to all other RIRs we could have done in this, let's say, microcycle 3, the answer is the RIR needs to get higher to get us the best relative SFRs the entire time. It's a big brainy idea, but the conclusion of that is this. Your best SFRs at an absolute level are always going to occur in the first or second microcycle of a meso, for sure. And they fall later and then you deload. But in any given microcycle, as the microcycles get through accumulation, the best SFR generated in any single microcycle is going to be of a decreasing RIR, which means 3 or 4 reps in reserve was the best SFR you could have done in micro 1 and also absolutely the best. In micro 2, it might be like 2 or 3 RIR because anything lower, the raw stimulus magnitude is so small that the rising fatigue gives you a not so great SFR. So essentially, as we go from micro to micro to micro, we should probably decrease our RIRs, which is to say go closer and closer and closer to failure until the last microcycle, getting like 1 rep away or at failure, gives you your best SFRs for that microcycle versus any other SFRs or that you could have done with other RIRs. So if you're like, ooh, last microcycle, let's do an RIR 3. Nope, awful SFR. RIR 3 only gets you the best SFRs if it's done in the first or second microcycle, not in the last one of an accumulation phase. And you could say, well, crap, so we have to go closer to failure as we push, but the absolute level of SFR still falls. Absolutely. And if you say, well, hold on a second, why don't we just go to failure in the first microcycle? Well, then your SFR is going to be not as great as it could be because you're going way too close to failure, right? So we say, well, hold on. Why is that a problem? Because the fatigue is too high. It's not the stimulus magnitude that's the problem, right? If you do a microcycle 1 and you do a really, RIR 0 all the way to failure, your stimulus magnitude's great. It's just your fatigue is too high, not by a lot, but just by a little bit. So if you do 3 or 4 RIR, it's better. But 3 or 4 RIR is kind of like sitting here as far as raw stimulus magnitude. And 0 RIR might be sitting here. And if you can think of fatigue or anabolic resistance that occurs every single microcycle that builds, it's kind of like a rising, like tide pool of water that makes a minimum level for when something is tenable or not or really worth it. So if you're up here with 1 RIR or 0 RIR and here's 3 or 4 RIR, right here, it's good when the tide waters of fatigue aren't over it. But at some point at like 2 or 3 microcycles in, the tide waters start to go over, right? And then this 3 or 4 reps in reserve starts to have a really crappy SFR because it's just not enough stimulus to overcome anabolic resistance. And now you're growing this much muscle and getting not a crazy amount of fatigue, but a good sizable portion. If you're getting really close to failure, the only thing that ends up saving you is the fact that your fraction of muscle growth is much bigger. And yeah, you have more fatigue, but the fraction of this versus this is still better than this tiny thing versus that, even though it's lower fatigue, absolutely. So let's just turn around a little bit. It's a pretty detailed concept, right? And we can expand it one more. So not only through a mesocycle do SFRs on an absolute level fall, okay, but this is probably the case as well for a career. So the best stimulus to fatigue ratio to use on beginners on average in a mesocycle is like 3 or 4, which means beginners can start at RIR like 5 or 6, like remotely not even close to failure. They get great gains demonstrated in a bunch of studies. And you don't have to go super hard. And if you do, you're actually paying a little bit too much fatigue cost for the stimulus you're getting, which is better, but just not worth the fatigue cost. As you go from beginner to intermediate to advanced, the RIR optimality starts to probably change for SFR so that your best stimulus to fatigue ratio when you were beginner might have been 3 or 4 on average. When you're intermediate, it might be around 2, which is why we use that figure. When you're advanced, this is not for sure, but based on all the theory we've been talking about, it's speculative, but likely that an advanced individual, 7 to 10 years training plus, typical IFBB pro, 0 or 1 RIR might actually be their best SFRs. What? That means they might start a microcycle with just 1 or 2 reps in the tank. And then in the middle, start a mesocycle with 1 or 2 reps in the tank. In the middle of the accumulation phase, they might be 1 rep in the tank or failure. And then they might do 1 or 2 weeks after, probably just 1, of going beyond failure and doing, intensity techniques like, someone helping you up with a concentric and then you do the eccentric by yourself, forced reps, so on and so forth. Crazy idea, but for them, their anabolic resistance is so high that nothing but the most absolutely high raw stimulus magnitudes might overcome that. In other words, in super plain language, if you're a pro or if you're an advanced lifter, you might have to train so hard, you just have to pay the fatigue cost for it. Because anything lighter, you're like, man, I wish my fatigue was way lower if I trained not as hard. Sweet. But for you now, training not as hard maybe gets you no growth at all. So, if we have a stimulus of 0, it doesn't matter what the denominator is. You're doing real bad on your SFR, right? Anything else would have been better. Any tiny number would have been better than 0. So as you go from the beginning of your mesocycle to the end, your SFRs drop. Nothing you can do about that, but you can help it a little bit by decreasing your RIRs, going closer and closer and closer to failure, roughly starting at 3 and ending at 0. If you're a beginner, you might even start at 5 or 6 and go all the way to 2 or 3 reps in reserve. Great. If you're intermediate, you might start at 3 or 4 and go all the way to 0. Totally fine. And if you're advanced, you might start at 1 or 2 and go all the way to beyond failure. Right? And notice the other big implication. You get your best SFRs when you're a beginner, right? And you get decent SFRs when you're intermediate, and you get dog shit SFRs when you're advanced. And somebody can be like, oh, that sucks. Well, that's just reality. And it's fundamentally muscle growth is constrained by a variety of physiological processes. It just gets harder to do. People will say like, oh man, what's his name on the pro stage looked great. If he adds another 5 pounds of muscle next year, he'll come back and just win the Olympia. Look, adding 5 pounds of muscle at that is you have to move heaven and earth. Whereas for beginner, adding 5 pounds of muscle is like, I'm going to show up to the gym twice a week, for the next 6 months and I'll have 10 pounds of muscle. Right. So, and we'll come back to this later at the end of this lecture. A really, really big point that yes, your SFRs will fall over the career, but you can do things like everything in this lecture to keep them higher than they could have fallen if you weren't worried about this kind of stuff. All right. SFR and exercise selection. Some of this is review, but basically point number 1 here is you got to know which exercises for you lead to the best SFRs on average and do them more often, right? So first you got to rank them. Like if someone says, hey, what is your best SFR? Do you get more out of leg extensions, hack squats, or leg presses? And you're like, I have no idea. Well, then how are you supposed to be choosing the best exercises, right? I'm sure you guys have done, like maybe you're traveling and used a different kind of bench press machine or some chest press machine. And you're like, I swear to God, the only thing this machine does is it wrenches my shoulders and elbows and I don't get a pump and I hate it. Who the fuck designed this thing, right? Bad SFR. But then you might travel and see some other machines that maybe you have them at your gym, maybe you don't, where it's the perfect track, unbelievable pump. You're like, oh my God, this is like a direct connection to my chest and my shoulders and elbows feel great, right? That's awesome. So if you have a ranked list of lifts, which do better for you than worse, you're way ahead of the game. And then you use mostly the ones that rank the highest. But here's the deal. Somebody could ask the question of like, well, so if we have a ranked list of like, let's say 1 to 5 best SFR exercise for each muscle group, why don't we just use the number 1, right? Why do we have to use number 2 and 3? Well, first of all, because we need variation, because variation is beneficial. Just doing one of anything is a bad idea for a variety of reasons. Principal variation is important, and we can't just say we'll just do the best exercise forever. But there's something a little bit more intricate here that is very interesting. If you overuse the same exercise, it starts to go stale. The staleness itself decreases its SFR until it's not as good of SFR as the exercise it used to be better than. So your ideal exercises will change. You don't want to get to that point with exercises where you have to change them because they're so stale, they suck, any sooner than you have to. So what you can do is in your program at any one time, whether it's per week, per mesocycle, per macrocycle, have a couple exercises in there for the same muscle group, the top 4 SFR exercises, not just the top 1. So a quick example on how staleness can drop SFR. Well, we have the 3 and 3 raw stimulus magnitude factors and the 3 fatigue factors, and we could just compare them, how they rank on SFR and see how staleness affects every single one of those. So mind-muscle connection. Okay, almost the definition of staleness in the regular arsenal of thinking about lifting is an exercise feels stale because I cannot get as good of a mind-muscle connection. You ever do curls, like you've done dumbbell curls for like 6 months and you do them, you're like, I don't fucking know what these are doing anymore. I don't even know if I'm using my biceps or what the hell's going on. I hate it, right? So staleness, by overusing the best SFR exercise, drops the mind-muscle connection, which of course lowers the raw stimulus magnitude. Even fatigue is identical. Lowering the raw stimulus magnitude decreases SFR. And now maybe easy curls had this SFR and regular barbell curls had this one. But now after the mind muscle connection has been reduced, maybe we're here. Still worth it though. So let's keep going. What about the pump? Okay. Stale exercises give you less of a pump, require more sets to get the same pump they used to. Down shrinks our SFR once again. What about muscle disruption? The ability to really, really disrupt the target muscle, right? Well, if an exercise is stale, what ends up happening is you do like 8 sets of it. It used to be like you did 6 sets and afterwards your biceps were like, oh my God, like something's wrong with me. You used to try to brush your teeth and you're like, I'm having a muscle spasm. I can't do this, right? Good indicator that you cause some growth if your muscles are fairly well disrupted and maybe even they get sore. But how sore do you get after using exercise for 6 months? Even how much disruption do you feel in it? Like you do it 8 sets of curls and you're like, And someone's like, what do you feel? You feel your biceps like all fucked up, right? And you're like, I don't know, my elbows hurt. My biceps feel fine. Not a good sign. Down shrinks your raw stimulus magnitude. And of course, goes down your SFR. And now we might even have a tie, right? Where straight barbell curls normally aren't our highest SFR, but we've brought this SFR of easy curls basically to a tie. So now we could sort of use both. This is when you show up to the gym and your training partner's like, hey, do you want to trade out exercises? You're like, yeah, I still feel easy curls are like at least as good as anything else. They're not like stale, but like maybe a couple weeks we'll see, right? Another mesocycle. We haven't even gotten to the fatigue stuff yet. What does staleness do to fatigue? Joint and connective tissue disruption. Oh my God. Almost another definition of stale exercises, ones that really start to bother your joints. Yeah, hack squat was great, but now your knees hurt every time you do hack squats. And like you don't really feel that leg press in your gym's corner, but you're like, man, I'm starting to feel like I want to do that leg press, at least my knees won't hurt, right? All of a sudden, whatever exercises we've been doing that had our best SFR might be less now. And now that leg press or that barbell curl that you didn't want to do because it had a lower SFR, now it has the absolutely higher SFR. That's pretty cool, right? But it might only as soon as you start using it, it starts to go stale itself. And then, this gets not stale. So you'd be like, let's alternate week after week after week of these 2 exercises because they're about equivalent. Maybe you don't want to do that because it violates some specificity concerns. So let's see what the other fatigue factors do. RPE, how much something essentially psychologically beats you up, how much effort it takes, right? And that's the thing, remember, fatigue is also psychological. If you're doing an exercise, especially you've built up to doing really heavy loads on it, and you're really in tune with how the exercise is supposed to be done, but it's also stale as shit, you're going to feel like you're working really, really hard. You're going to be doing these cable curls. Oh my God, get me out of here. I hate this, right? It takes so much effort to do these things. But if you do a new exercise, because of the novelty, you don't have to use as much load. And because it's psychologically enjoyable, because it's different, your RPE, rating of perceived exertion, it's just not that high. So all of a sudden you're taking less psychological and neural fatigue from the same exercise. So boom, SFR shrinks one more time if staleness continues, right? And of course, unused muscle strength fall off, how much an exercise affects another muscle after it. It might not change a lot unless your RPE is so high for this exercise now that's stale that it drains the living shit out of you, and you have to really pump up a lot of central drive to do it and get through it, and then you go on to the next. So for example, let's say you're doing an exercise you just fucking hate because it beats up your joints, it takes a ton of effort to do, takes a ton of effort to do a pump, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for the same raw stimulus magnitude, you have to do a ton of work, just physically more volume, right? How much does that affect your strength in the next exercise, right? As opposed to doing like 3 or 4 sets of barbell curls and getting a gnarly pump and then doing lateral raises and being like, this is great. You're now doing like 8 sets of easy curls. You feel like shit. And then lateral raises, you're like, man, I'm tired. I can't do these that much. So your strength falls off on that second exercise in the unused muscle group. So essentially, staleness, and don't get this twisted, this is exactly what I mean when I say it, affects every single part of your stimulus to fatigue ratio by dropping it. So if you have 3 or 4 or 5 top SFR exercises, don't worry that like, oh, we got to really do this one and fuck all these, they suck. No. We want to do this one for sure, but we want to keep a couple of these in the rotation as well during any particular, let's say 2 of them during a particular mesocycle or several. And then once the SFR for these drops, the SFR for these is going to be higher. And we might do these 2 and give these a break to reestablish the best SFRs. Very, very, very straightforward. All right. Technique. Stimulus to fatigue ratios affect, or rather exercise techniques effect on the SFR. First of all, a really important question to ask every time you want to know this is, what is the target muscle with this exercise, right? Because it's really hard to gauge SFRs, not even by calculation, just in your own head. Somebody could ask you like, hey, you're doing like a close grip bench and someone's like, how does that hit your muscles? And you're like, super well. And they're like, yeah, like your chest. And you're like, oh, I thought you meant triceps. Like, that's why I'm doing this, right? It's okay to have an exercise hit multiple muscle groups. It's totally fine. I would say that if you're really serious about hypertrophy training, and especially if you're listening to this lecture and plan on implementing a lot of this stuff, every exercise should have a 1 priority muscle group, which you really think about. During the time, the mind-muscle connection and the technique is designed to hit that muscle. And if other muscles are also hit, great. So for example, you could do close grip bench. In your case, you might use it for triceps. And when you use it for triceps, when you're lowering it, you're like triceps, keep my elbows tucked in, triceps lock out powerfully, right? Yes, your pecs will be contracting. They will be getting a hypertrophy stimulus. Yes, you have to integrate your pecs, work on that into your total weekly volume landmarks for sure. But how you calculate SFR, because you are purposefully doing triceps, like you say, okay, close grip bench is for triceps. That's why I'm doing it today, because I'm training triceps. Then it'll help you make sure that you get the most out of the exercise for the triceps. Okay. So super important to pick probably 1 muscle group and then let the others collect what they will. Right. And then once you have whatever exercise you're focusing on for that, number of sets, you can slowly experiment with a technique to try to improve the stimulus to fatigue ratio. And it's really quite simple, especially with mind-muscle connection. That's your first start, but not the only one, right? Whichever exercise lets you feel the tension throughput at high weights, a ton, or at low weights, feel the crazy burn exactly in the muscle you want. Whatever technique gets you there, that's probably a pretty good technique. Like imagine someone saying, hey man, I want you on the leg press to go out real wide and then just do these half reps with a ton of weight. And let me know when you feel your quads. You do a whole set. You're like, I never felt my fucking quads. I never felt any tension through my quads. I felt it through my adductors and my glutes. And I never got any lactate or anything like that. No burn. Like that sucks. But if you take your leg press and you put it, legs together and low on the platform, all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, my quads are first of all going to break off of my legs at heavy weights. And then at lighter weights, I feel like there's some kind of like something frying literally inside my quads. Right? Help. That's a great thing. So mind muscle connection is your biggest tool to get to altering technique. It's like a sensor for you. It's a guide, right? You don't know where your best technique is, but you could sort of be like, where's the best mind muscle connection? You experiment a little bit. And when you find that, that's probably going to be a good thing. But there's other ways to check too. What gives you the best pumps, right? We talked about the burns thing. What gives you the best pumps is really good. what seems to disrupt your muscles the most after training. So for example, you can try a technique on the chest fly, you walk out of the session and like right after the session, you're like, I don't know, my chest like pump, whatever, but it feels more or less the same. I don't feel like it fried it. And then a couple hours later, it feels fine. And then a day later, there's no soreness. But if you find a technique on the chest fly in which afterwards, like, oh my God, there's something wrong with my pecs. And they're like sitting there and sometimes they're like contracting by themselves, like, holy shit, I fucked something up, which is good, right? To a point. And then you get like a little bit sore the next day and you're like, wow, okay, whatever like grip width or whatever I changed seems to be hitting me more. And of course, the fatigue stuff, joint and connective tissue soreness, how RPE, like you could find a way to use the bench machine, which is not even that hard, but you get a gnarly chest pump. Awesome. Versus like you have to grind like shit and then your chest doesn't do anything. So SFR, same stuff. I'm not going to review what the multiple components is. The highest raw stimulus magnitude you have and the lowest fatigue magnitude you could have, all the little techniques make a small bit of difference. Now, here's the deal. If you're fundamentally doing good biomechanics in the exercise, like full range of motion, hitting the target muscle generally, don't go crazy and be like, I got to change my technique every day to get the best SFR. Just be aware of shit that's obvious. And you can obviously change to do better and try to keep the changes around to see if it consistently gives you good results. Because one day it could feel good, one day not. It's not much to conclude. So I would do it a couple of microcycles, probably a mesocycle or two in a row of a specific kind of technique. See if it compares well to another. So for example, stuff you can do, body setup, like arch or not on an incline. Like on an incline bench, you could take a really big arch or not. See which one is better for your upper pecs that you're targeting. Grip width, right? Like, is this a medium grip bench or is this a medium grip bench? Or is that a medium grip bench? Or is this a medium and this is close? Well, that's up to you and your body's built differently than everyone. You could grip like this and get an awesome chest pump and your elbows don't hurt. You could grip like this and you get a shitty chest pump and your elbows hurt like shit. It's clear which one has the best SFR, right? And it's all about what's best for you. Someone can tell you, hey, try this. And if it doesn't work for you, it sucks. I've actually trained with a few IFBB professional bodybuilders and ran through with them through their exercises. And it was really fun. And I learned some cool stuff, but some of the exercises they were doing, this fucking sucks. And it's not that it sucks. They thought it was great because it was great for them. I didn't like it because it didn't work for my body, right? Entire exercises or the specific kind of techniques they were using. Easy one is foot width. How wide do you squat? How wide do you put your leg press? How wide do you put your leg curl? Totally super, super individual, whichever one has the best SFR. Toe angle, right? A lot of people, when I do leg curls, I point my toes out. And a bunch of people ask me like, why do you do that? I'm like, that's just where they go when I feel my hamstrings the most. That's it. There's no fucking magic. Point it this way, semimembranosis and all that shit. Like, that's way, way, way too specific. And if you want to go on those tangents, fine. Just make sure you don't trade away overload. For me, I could overload better, feel the muscles better. My knees and everything else hurt less if my toes naturally go out. You can experiment with a bunch of different stuff yourself. How you end up putting yourself into various positions is another big one. Just an example. So for example, for triceps, if you're doing skull crushers, you can sit back, sort of sit your arms back away from your triceps. So when you're starting the movement, your elbows, your upper arm moves up and then you break at the elbows, or you can sit the weight into your triceps by breaking down this way and then going that way. Same thing as with a squat. If you sit into the squat, kind of forward into your quads and then down, versus sitting back away from your quads and sort of back away and down from the quads the whole time. There's actually not a right or wrong here, because if you sit too far forward into your quads or your elbows, you get nasty elbow pain and knee pain if you're doing it for squats. On the other hand, if you sit way back away from your squat, you probably won't get any knee pain. You might get hip pain though, because your back starts to round, or you just don't feel your quads that much. So your fatigue could go down, but your stimulus goes down too. So it's for you to find that best ratio of, okay, if I sit into my quads a little bit, it fries them, but it doesn't hurt my knees. So that's all up to you. And here's the thing, as long as it's safe fundamentally, there's no right or wrong here, right? Very limited person-to-person transfer, which is why a lot of questions, you can see me on my Instagram doing this, and it kind of looks like I'm a rude asshole. I'm trying not to be. People say like, Dr. Mike, why do you grab the bar like this or like that? Or why do you do that with your feet? Almost always it's like, who gives a shit, right? No, it's for sure. Everyone thinks that when people do particular techniques, it's for a very, very, very good reason. And it can be, but sometimes they're personal reason. They're like, this is just what gives me the highest stimulus to fatigue ratio. And then they ask, well, what should I do? You should start maybe where I start, or we're just some fundamental stuff that feels good, and then play a little bit here and there to see which one fits you best, right? Last point on this, big point. Glad I didn't forget to look at that. your techniques can change through your career, especially if you get much bigger or much leaner, right? I used to have the best possible SFR for my squat by grabbing close, just like this. Then my fucking biceps and forearms got so goddamn big, I have to hold the bar out here, because if I hold the bar here, I literally just get unbelievable elbow pain. And I'm like, okay, this is awful, right? Where you do your pull downs. Some people can't, their lats and shoulders are so big, they can't touch their chest with pull downs. And you say, well, that's wrong. It's not wrong. It's the lowest they can possibly go. All kinds of different stuff will change as you get bigger. When you get leaner, you'll be able to squat deeper and leg press deeper than you ever did before. That might even mean you can move your feet down and closer because you don't have to make as much room for your gut. People say, like, why'd you change your leg press technique? Well, I can do this now and it works better. But if you tried to do that before, simply your hips would come up and your lower back would round, right? So essentially, don't get glued to one technique as like, okay, this is exactly how I squat and everything else sucks. For a month, for two, for a block, that'll be totally true. But if you notice that one technique just is not getting you the same SFRs as it used to, play around with a little bit of other stuff. And a lot of times it's not really like a mystery. Like when it starts to hurt your elbows to try to grip close together, what's the answer? It's probably not grip even closer, right? It's like, okay, let me go wider and then wider and then wider. And eventually out super wide. Another hilarious thing is it better to grip the bar like this or just put your hands over the bar? Well, ideally it's better to grip it because you get more stable, right? So people say like Mike, like, why do you put your hands out here in the bar? I would love to fucking grip the bar, but I can't because my elbows are going to fucking kill me. So another interesting thing, as you go through your career, the absolute SFRs go down, but relatively speaking at any one time, you got to pick the best technique for them, right? And a lot of the pros that do partial range of motion, if you look, they're actually doing full range for how big they are. They just can't fit anymore. All right. SFR and set numbers per exercise. So if we're doing leg press, do we get better SFRs on average if we do 2 sets of leg press or like 4 sets of leg press or maybe like 6 or maybe like 8? Well, generally speaking, the highest SFRs on average, especially for beginners and intermediates, are going to be with the lowest set numbers because there's a certain amount of anabolic stimulus to collect, right? And it takes a certain amount of effort to do so. And you're very sensitive. You have a certain amount to collect total when you start training session. As you do one set, you might collect like 30 or 40% of it. Set number 2 collects, another 20% or something like that. So you're well halfway to it. All the other sets collect less and less and less of it. But all the other sets are approximately equivalently as hard, certainly pretty hard. And it ends up being that the raw stimulus magnitude of the first set is this, and the fatigue is that. Raw stimulus magnitude of the second set is going to be lower, much lower, but the fatigue is like a little lower maybe, but comparable, right? So your SFRs don't degrade like this with more and more sets of the same exercise, but they kind of like sort of hang in there and then they start to go down, right? So after a while, we're going to see a decline. Now, you could say, well, doesn't that mean we just need to do a few different, exercises like sort of all the time? Let's say instead of doing 6 sets of leg press, we do 2 sets of leg extension, 2 sets of leg press, 2 sets of squats, same number of total sets, but we always change the exercise. Well, there's downsides to that too. So for example, there's a warm-up downside, especially for mind, muscle, and technique adjustment. You start to do leg presses. Your first set's going to be great, but you're like, you know what? My feet were out too far on that. You bring them in a little bit. And you go, no, now that I have a pump, I can actually move my feet out a little bit again, and I can lower my hips. And every single set, you probably notice this in your own training, if you do like 4 sets of something, every single set, the mind-muscle connection feels a little bit better. The technique fits a little bit better. So our SFRs are sort of mitigated. They don't fall as fast as we would think. If you change exercises altogether, you're now dealing with a bunch of the fatigue, very little anabolic stimulus left to collect because a lot of that's just specific to the muscle, not the exercise. But now you sort of have to re-warm up. Like if you were, instead of doing 4 sets of leg presses, you did 2 sets of leg presses and then moved down to leg extensions. The first set of leg extensions is going to be good, but it's going to kind of be like, oh, that was a good set, but I should have had my feet a little wider. And then the second set's a little better than the first in that sense. And it's sort of like this little pains of adjustment, right? It's almost like this. I always make race car analogies for some goddamn reason. I don't even follow motorsport, but it just makes sense. If you got a guy who is in the Le Mans or something, 24-hour race, and he's got his car and he's racing his car, and the car, accumulates fatigue, right? You say, should he dump his current car and switch to a new car halfway through the race? The argument for yes is like the new car is not going to be as worn down, bolts are tighter, so on and so forth. But the problem is he has to get used to a new car. And of course, like he will. He's a fucking baller race car driver, and he's probably used that car before. But man, in the middle of a race, man, as a race goes on, you start timing your turns really well, exactly for the car you're driving. You switch your car, the first couple of laps, maybe the first dozen laps, are awkward as fuck, and it's just a cost you don't have to pay. So switching exercises too soon to pursue new ones does not improve the SFR and might actually degrade it, right? So SFR stays pretty stable for an exercise for a while, and switching exercises won't help. But at some point, the SFR goes down probably to essentially like an acute staleness, where you do so many sets of an exercise that it's not, your technique isn't better anymore. You just want to get off the fucking thing, if not for your psychological reasons, but also because you've sort of reworn the same joint structure so many times. You're like, man, I don't really want to, I can't incline bench any more than this, right? Or the particular fibers you have sort of allotted, now you've pretty much maxed them out anabolic signaling wise, and it's time to switch gears a little bit, switch angles to get a new fresh super group of fibers that haven't been super stimulated. So like if you've been incline pressing for a while, maybe it's time to do some flat pressing to get the fibers you want. Or if you're leg pressing for a while, maybe it's time to do some leg extensions and some squats to get some fibers that you weren't focusing on, right? Because their stimulus allotment hasn't been nearly filled yet. When does this happen? We have no idea. We have some idea. Educated guess from Dr. James Hoffman and myself, including Jared Feather, probably like after about 5 or 7 sets of the same exercises. And if you think about it from your own real world training, you can probably remember that that's probably pretty true. Like, somebody could say, hey, you did 2 sets of leg press. Let's switch exercises. You might think, man, I got a couple more sets. After about 4 or 5 sets of leg press, if someone says, let's switch, because you got to do, let's say 10 sets total that day anyway, you're probably pretty inclined to be like, yeah, I feel like now squatting will be a fresh take and the SFR will be really good. Maybe the first set of squats won't be that great of SFR, but after that, I'll really catch my groove. It'll be awesome. So I'll do like 4 and 4, right? But if someone was like, hey, you got a leg press for 8 sets, fuck, after like set number 6, you may be like, man, I don't want to be here anymore. You start to avoid the biggest concentrations of stimulus and pump, and the biggest, essentially you start to avoid the mind muscle connection will get you the most because you're already trying to get away from the exercise. And your SFR might degrade on the fatigue side because your knees start to hurt a little bit. There's only so much leg pressing you can do in the same session. So essentially after about 5 to 7 sets, probably need to change, but after 2 or 3 sets, before 2 or 3 sets, there's probably no need to change, and it might even lower your SFR. After 5 to 7, probably need to change. And you can use this right away in your programming. So if you have an average number of sets you have to hit per session, you can figure out how many exercises you're going to use. Usually it's like just 1 or 2 exercises. What you don't want to do is use 3 exercises for no reason, or just 1 exercise for no reason. All right. Now, not per exercise, but per session, per muscle group. We have to train chest. What is the SFR optimized at as far as number of sets for chest or for quads in 1 session? Well, for beginners and intermediates, especially for beginners, SFR is maximized with low set numbers. Okay. So your first set, remember, there's that total amount of anabolic stimulus to collect. Your first set is tough, but not really fatigue-wise much tougher than the other sets. It collects most of it already. It's essentially the low-hanging fruit sort of, I don't call it a problem, phenomenon, right? This happens with almost everything. Like, what's the easiest food to reach in your fridge? It's the food that's there first. Okay, is there anything special about the food in the back? No, it's just you have to reach around stuff. And until I eat this food here, that other food's tough. Set-wise, it's just the same way. You get most of your growth from the first set. Not that there's anything magical about the first set. It's just that the most easiest growth triggering pathways are just here, and they're like, that's it, hit me up. As soon as you hit up those pathways, you get more resistance from hitting other pathways, and just how much effort you have to put in to continue to stimulate muscle growth just goes up, right? So the best SFRs are usually at the low set numbers, first set, second set, third set, so on and so forth, right? Now, you could say, that means we have to do very few sets per session and just do lots of sessions. But that's an interesting solution that doesn't work because we've have good literature and very good theory to suggest, actually the literature shows this, that the more frequency you do, the lower your SFR is for any given session. Okay, so there seems to be no way around this. You can have a relatively high volume session of dog shit SFR towards the end, or you can have 3 low volume sessions with the first one great SFR, the second one shittier, and the third one also shitty. And then all of a sudden your average SFR, there's a kind of a middle range there where you can't really just obviate this problem. So yes, your frequency should be a good frequency, but as long as you're in a general frequency range, the per set and per frequency all essentially cancels out and you're left with roughly the same SFRs, right? And if you have to have a certain volume, whether it's you spread it into a bunch of sessions or in one session, you just have to deal with SFR. For example, let's say your minimum effective volume for a particular session is 5 sets. Like if you don't do 5 sets of chest, you won't grow. 4 sets doesn't grow your chest. It's just maintenance for you at this point, right? You could say, well, my SFR would be the best at 4 sets. No, it won't, because zero growth. You get 0 net growth. Your SFR is fucking 0. Your SFR first starts to be good at 5 sets. Or even if you look at just sort of very hypothetical SFR of like, if I could grow, yeah, then of course you would grow more from the first set and the second set, but that's just not enough. So if someone comes to the gym and they're doing 6 sets of chest, you could be like a wise ass. You'd be like, you get your best SFRs from the first 2 sets, and they could be like, well, I need 6 sets minimum to grow. What do you think about that? And you're like, word up, fam. I got nothing for you. So remember, SFR is the king of all muscle growth measurements, but it's not the only one. It's not the only concern. Fundamentally, raw stimulus magnitude trumps everything because that's actual muscle growth being stimulated. Yeah, there's a fatigue component, but sometimes you just have to get a certain amount of raw stimulus magnitude. And if you're willing to pay incrementally higher and higher fatigues for it, sometimes you just have to do it. So people will say, the best bang for your buck is low volume programs. Totally. But if you want a certain total raw stimulus magnitude, a certain total bang, you're just going to have to pay out a certain number of bucks. Period. Right? It's like someone saying to you, if you ship a package from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., which is just not that far away, you only pay $10, per mile, or I don't know, like 10 cents per mile on the truck. You're like, well, that's pretty good, right? And you say, okay, well, if you send a package from Philadelphia to Kansas City, you have to pay 15 cents per mile, not 10 cents per mile. It goes up. And you're like, right. Okay, so it's a worse deal. Like, yeah, well, better bang for your buck to ship it to Washington, D.C. Okay. And your response is, what if I have to ship a package to fucking Kansas City, though? Like, yeah. You just have to do that then. That's it, right? So yeah, ideally, we do lower volume programs. And people say this all the time, like, you'll see like T-Nation articles like low volume programs are the best or low number of sets per session. Sure. But if you have to grow more than that, yeah, you'll have to deal with dog shit SFRs to get enough raw stimulus to make a difference in your physique to go where you want to go, right? People also say like, hey, you're a bodybuilder, like eating 6 meals a day is not mandatory for gains. For sure, but it is mandatory to look as good as you possibly can. If that's what you want, that's just what you have to do, right? So SFR, after the first set, even if a new beginner, let's say, SFR would start to drop off. Definitely. But it doesn't drop off nearly as much as we would think because it's mitigated by some factors. So there's a warm-up component, right? Essentially, when you're not warmed up, your fastest switch fibers don't even activate. So if you don't warm up super great, your first set is like a very good set, but a lot of your really fast twitch fibers didn't even turn on towards the end. Then when you do your second set, you're more warmed up and you get more faster fiber recruitment. And all of a sudden, hypertrophy is pretty similar and this fatigue is pretty similar. Your SFR is still kicking it. It's still hanging in there even after the first set and the second set, right? Mind-muscle connection. We've been through this before. Mind-muscle connection improves every single set up to maybe like 5 sets. So that mitigates the drop in SFR. Now the SFR is not going like this after set and set and set. You might be going like that, just dropping a little bit. There's a higher effective reps fraction, right? So if you do 15 reps on your first set and you do 7 reps to failure on your second set, remember that those cause a very similar amount of hypertrophy as far as set to set to set is concerned, primarily because much, not most or not all, much of the hypertrophy is caused by the last 3 or 4 very difficult reps, the effective reps, so to speak. Well, if you have a set of 15 reps and only the last, let's say 5 are very effective, your next set, because you're so tired for whatever reason after, you might have 10 reps, but then your fraction of effective reps here is 1/3 in the 15, your best set. But in your not so great set, your fraction of effective reps, 2 reps that are not as great, is 1/2. That's actually a better fraction, right? That's one of the cool things behind the Berge Fagarelli's Maya reps training system is that as your first working set is 20 reps or something, but then it's like 5, 5, 5, 3, 3, 3, and then you quit. All of those mini sets are like very hypertrophic for how many reps you're getting. Now, it turns out they still accrue more fatigue than stimulus compared to the first set, but not nearly by as much as you would think, which means the SFR doesn't just drop like that after the first set. It hangs in pretty good region for a while. And another one is local to systemic fatigue ratio. We'll cover that one in depth when we talk about different muscle group training per session and how that happens. But essentially, local fatigue is accumulated with every single successive set you do one after another. Systemic fatigue is just accumulated over the course of any session as far as time is concerned. So if you say, okay, I can only do 2 sets of this, you get a certain level of local fatigue and a certain level of systemic. If you increase the number of sets you're doing here, yeah, you'll get more systemic fatigue, but you'll get more local fatigue too. And your ratio of local fatigue to systemic fatigue starts to get a little bit better as you pound the same muscle over and over with multiple sets. And remember, local fatigue does cause hypertrophy to some extent. Systemic fatigue doesn't. But as that ratio improves, it keeps your SFR from not getting as bad. Okay. So all that taken together, it means that for beginners, our SFR starts at 1 set, it's the best, and then again, maybe by like, 4, 6 sets, it's pretty low. For an intermediate person, we have another interesting problem here, right? So, well, are we going to cover it here? We're going to save it for a little bit. We'll cover it now. We'll review it later. Too juicy to spill. So, intermediate person, they have a problem, which is, yes, the first set is stimulative, but not stimulative enough to pass that anabolic threshold that we have built up. So if you just do 1 set at a time, right, and even with a really good frequency, you might cause 0 muscle growth because it's not beyond the minimum effective volume. And for an advanced person, you might have to do 2 or 3 sets as essentially almost in some technical sense like warm-up sets. They're definitely contributing to hypertrophy drive, but no net hypertrophy until you do like a 4th one. And that's the first thing that gets you over the spill and gets you to where you need to go, right? So what ends up happening here is the SFR for beginners starts very high and immediately drops off, and not super quick. The one for intermediate folks starts actually a little lower, crests at 2 or 3 sets, hangs in for a while, and then drops off at 8-ish or something like that. For an advanced person, the SFR might actually climb to where it's highest at 4 or 5 sets and then falls off after that. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But from an absolute perspective, let's say just for the average intermediate, after about 8 to 12 sets, the SFR no longer does the slow drop. It starts to drop really, really fast. One reason is that neural fatigue is always going up. Neural drive goes down, your nervous system's ability to get as much juice out of especially the faster twitch fibers of the muscle that are the most growth prone starts to go really, really poorly. And then your idea of what a working set is it's just not working all that great, plain and simple. So there starts to be a big downside to that. The collection of muscle growth from each set starts to go down. So basically, you get this much muscle growth to stimulate total. Your first set might do this, your second set that, up to here. When you're on your 8th and 12th set or whatever, you're like doing this, right? You're getting real close to the top, and you might even go over the top to where it's negative, right? But you have these tiny little fractions to collect. But what's the fatigue of each set? I mean, it's the fatigue of a working set. It's about the same as it was for the first, as it is for the 8th. So you're putting this much fatigue into your 8th set to collect this much hypertrophy. Your SFR sucks. Right? Another problem, your mind-muscle connection starts to degrade after a certain number of sets. After 10 sets of chest, I don't even know what you're training, and you don't know what you're training either. You're doing flies, and someone's like, do you feel your chest? Like, honestly, I haven't felt my chest in the last 3 sets we did, right? So that degrades, which is really, really bad. A lot of that degrades due to excitation-contraction, decoupling. It's basically, you have the nerve, tells the muscle to contract. When you have enough junk, the nerve is really tired, and you have enough junk in the synapse there, and then your muscles are really poor at receiving signals now because there's metabolites everywhere and parts are broken. All of a sudden, the nerve's not that good at telling the muscle to contract anymore, and you just don't get as much stimulus, right? So for most people in training, 3 to 8 sets per session, especially for the intermediate, probably gets your best per week SFRs at normal frequencies. So if you come in and you do only 1 or 2 sets, you might have actually had a better SFR taking the whole week into consideration, because we know that added frequency creates problems for SFR. 3 to 8 sets per session probably gives you better. So, if you're doing 1 or 2, it's probably not that great per session. If you're doing 14 and 15, it's probably not that great. 3 to 8 is probably where you have your best SFR. That doesn't mean that you only do 3 to 8. You might have to do 10 sets per session just to get enough hypertrophy, or you might have to do more sessions than is optimal for SFR just to get your raw stimulus management. But the closer you can get to it, the better. Next one. SFR and muscle group order within a session. We've already explained this a little bit, so just to finish it up. Here's the deal. Hypothetical example. Is it better to do 4 sets of chest, then 4 sets of back, then 4 sets of chest, then 4 sets of back? 16 sets total in exercise. Chest, back, chest, back. Is it better to do that, letting the chest and back rest every little while for, 10 minutes or whatever, while you're doing the other muscle group? Or is it better to make adjacent training? 8 sets of chest and then 8 sets of back. And then later in the week, do 8 sets of back and later 8 sets of chest. As we're training chest, 16 sets, simplest way to put it. Systemic fatigue, which does not contribute to hypertrophy and lowers your SFR, goes like that. As you're training your chest, your local fatigue in your chest goes like this. And remember, local fatigue is a little bit hypertrophic because metabolites are hypertrophic, because the disruption is hypertrophic, because the pump is hypertrophic, because the fraction of effective reps begins to rise. That's hypertrophic. Now, of course, local fatigue has its downsides too after too much of it is accumulated, but at least has some upsides. So if we're looking at a ratio of local fatigue to systemic fatigue, we want it as high as possible. The higher this ratio is, the better our SFR is. If we do some chest and then switch to back, that's 8 sets, okay? At the end of those 8 sets, systemic fatigue is exactly as high as it would be after the end of any 8 sets. But you never summed a ton of local fatigue in either one of these muscle groups because you split them up. Now we go with those 4 and 4 and move them over. Now we do 4 chest and 4 back again, same exercise. Now 16 sets, our systemic fatigue is fucking crazy, would be anyway. But we start doing chest and we've lost a bunch of local fatigue because it got washed out. And now we're doing chest where the local fatigue is not that great, but the systemic is as high as it ever was. So that ratio starts to degrade, which is not great. So if we're training a muscle group, as soon as we begin to train it, there's something to be said. Because of that local to systemic ratio, keep pounding it. It's like letting an opponent get up after you punch them. Don't let them get up. Go tackle them back down and finish the fight, so to speak. Because the more you can rain punches, the more at some point you're going to finish the job. Then if you get up and they get a chance to regroup, you have to do that many more punches to finish the job. You may have noticed this in your own training, that if you split up a bunch of muscles within a training session and go back to old muscles, you don't get as sore. You don't get as good of a pump. That's a sign that you're not summating enough actual stimulus. Acute fatigue never gets that high, but the systemic is always a problem. So when you have a choice, it seems like by a small margin, you might want to favor, when you do chest and back together, do your chest, finish it, do your back. And you could say, but Dr. Mike, hold on. That means we're training back last all the time. That sucks. It totally does. That's why another day when you train chest and back, you do back first and chest second. That way you get the clustering effect of training the muscle groups contiguously, but without the downside of having one of them take over the other completely. Next up, this one's really straightforward. SFR, a number of sets per session. Okay. So as you do more work, your systemic fatigue goes up. That sucks. That lowers your SFR. And as you do more work, with some caveats that we discussed already, your stimulus goes down. Terrible. So the more number of, the more you do as far as sets per session, kind of the worse it gets on average. Now, however, somebody could say, okay, that means that we should do as many different sessions as possible. But we have another problem. If you do 3 or 4 sessions per day, let's say you come in and do 5 sets and leave and then come back to the gym. Let's say you live at the gym. Is that better? Well, there's a problem there because your stress hormone levels are kind of always elevated and there's no distinct time to relax. that becomes, a problem for parasympathetic downtime. Essentially, humans aren't designed. You could also try this with sleep, for example. You could try work for 4 hours, sleep for 4 hours, work for 4 hours, sleep for 4 hours. Human beings are not designed like that. Maybe no systems are designed like that. Seems like physiological systems on planet Earth, like distinct stimulative times and very distinct prolonged times of no stimulus, relaxation, and recovery. That's fundamentally the SRA principle: stimulus, recovery, adaptation. And because once you get into the gym and you get warmed up and you get pumped, you're pretty good. That warm-up effect, that rise in catecholamine levels, that like, I'm ready to be here. If you just do 5 sets and leave, these catecholamines hang around and catabolize for no reason for an extra hour every day if you do like 3 or 4 sessions. But if you only do like 1 or 2 sessions, they rise, you train hard, they fall, and then you relax and repeat. So too many sessions is actually not a good solution to this problem. But the answer sure as hell isn't 1 session per day. So if you want to ask yourself what's the optimal number of sets per session, anything beyond 20 is probably not great. And you could say, oh, holy shit, I only train 4 times a week. I have to get 30 sets every session in order to make sure I get all the hypertrophy I need. That's totally fine. Remember, SFR is cool, but raw stim is what you're going for fundamentally. Like, you just have to grow some muscle and you can't train more than 4 times a week. That means you're going to have to bite the bullet a little bit. It's okay. There's no solution to that problem unless you want to use more sets. Unless you want to use more sessions, in which case you for sure should. And then the question can be asked, well, how many is too many? I would say the most number of sessions I would prescribe, based on reading the literature and working with a bunch of athletes and just thinking this stuff through, is probably 12 per week. That is to say, 1 day a week, I firmly believe, should almost always be used for dedicated total rest. Remember that SRA idea. And then you could potentially have AM and a PM every single day of the week. Steve Hall from Revive Stronger trains like that. Jared Feather has trained like that many times. I've trained like that. To be honest, I couldn't survive the 12. I've done 11 sessions. I've done 9 sessions very, very fruitfully. 9 sessions means 3 of the days I train once a week, 3 of the days of the week I train once, and 3 I train twice, right? But certainly the answer, because the fewer sets you do in any one session, the better the SFR is for that session, the answer is almost never train 4 times a week. There are pro bodybuilders that train 4 or 5 times a week. I can almost certainly assure you that they could be better if they trained more times per week. In Olympic weightlifting and other sports like that, that is unheard of, right? Top people in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Olympic weightlifting, wrestling, they all train multiple times a day. Sometimes 1 a day, sometimes 2 a day, sometimes 3 a days if the sessions are especially very easy. But almost nobody does 4 or 5 a day training because that tends to do all those things we talked about that are bad. All right. Weekly volume. And this is kind of a much shorter talk than it was going to be because of rehashing that whole dead zone concept, MV to MEV. So for beginners, the lower the volume, the highest stimulus to fatigue ratio, which is to say, each additional set brings lower and lower stimulus, right? Each additional set brings higher and higher fatigue. So SFR is best on set number 1. So if someone asks, what's the most efficient way to train for a beginner? I would say train like once a week. And for a couple of weeks, you'll get really efficient economical gains by SFR, best SFR. So you put the least amount of work in, get the best results for that level of work, not best absolute results. And then eventually you do 2 sessions a week, and then 3, and then 4, and then so on and so forth, and build up the volume there. So the lower the volume, the better. 1 working set per week, and then eventually 2 working sets, 4, 5, 6, blah, blah, blah. For intermediate advanced, we have that problem we talked about earlier where here's your minimum effective volume, here's your maintenance volume, and anything up to about 5 sets per week could just be going from maintenance volume to not yet minimum effective. This is what we call in the How Much Should I Train book, the dead zone, the volume dead zone between maintenance volume and minimum effective volume. It's more volume than you need to maintain, but not enough volume to do anything for you as far as growth. It's kind of like if you're like really, really hungry for a meal and you want to have a really good quality meal and someone's like, hey, do you want to wait for the sushi place to open or do you want like this half of a stale cheeseburger? You're like, well, nothing's going to happen to me if I don't eat right now. So I'm above maintenance volume for eating. If I have this halfway stale cheeseburger, it's not going to take me to my minimum effective sort of enjoyment of eating. No thanks, right? I'm sure you guys have done this before where someone's like, you can have a snack now and you can wait. You're like, fuck it, I'll wait because this is dog shit. It's in between some kind of zone of like, yes, it's technically food, but also it's awful. So it doesn't hit any of the boxes, right? So when you're intermediate, The best SFRs don't actually occur at the lowest volumes. They occur at volumes just above your minimum effective. And when you're advanced, super advanced, they also occur just above minimum effective, but your minimum effective is now real high. So for super advanced athletes, their best SFRs are actually at very high volumes because nothing short of those volumes is going to grow them. Pretty straightforward. Weekly frequency. Very straightforward. If you have too low of a frequency, you excessively damage the muscles each session, right? You try to do 15 sets of chest on Monday and then repeat next Monday. You get so much damage that half of that goes to chopping off growth and you don't get the best SFRs. On the other hand, if you have a very, very high frequency, you decided you're going to do train chest 8 times a week or something like that, especially joints and connective tissues cannot seem to keep up with that sort of thing. So what ends up happening is that also drops your SFR. So the best SFRs are probably somewhere in the middle of frequency, which is like 2 to 4 sessions per muscle group per week in many cases. Not all. Sometimes you can do less. Sometimes you can do more. But that's a really good shotgun approach to where your best SFRs are going to be. SFR and weekly exercise selection number. This answers the question of, okay, I have 3 quad workouts this week. Do I do leg press, squat, leg extension, or do I do squat, 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 or do I do, leg press, leg extension? Which one of those is better from an SFR perspective? Well, if you switch exercise every single session, you might miss out on some technical improvements because if you do squat, 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 you're practicing the squat every single time, which is a good thing. Your technique improves and your SFR might improve as well. But, right, that might just be a mitigating factor. You might not have such technical improvements that are so awesome. And also you have an overuse problem there where if you squat 3 times a week, yes, you might get a little better at squatting and better mind muscle, but also you're overusing. So your staleness builds up faster and also just your joints can't take it after a while. And that drops the SFR by itself, even if, the muscle doesn't feel stale. So it's probably okay to use the same exercise twice in 1 week. So you could have heavy bent rows Monday, lighter bent rows after pull downs Wednesday. And then when you need to do another horizontal movement Friday, maybe do machine rows or something like that. So it's okay to double up on movements, but any more than doubling is probably not great. And if you switch movements every single time, especially with super high frequency, you might just run out of effective movements, or you're switching movements so much, there's some directed adaptation that becomes missing there. So if you have lots of sessions, more than 2, it's okay and maybe even optimal to reuse one of the movements for the same general plane. Reuse it once, which is to say do it twice a week. But I probably wouldn't do the same exercise more than twice a week, even if I was training with high frequency. Similar exercise is fine, probably not the same one. Really, really minor point there. All right. SFR and cumulative fatigues over the mesos and blocks. We already know over the career the SFR falls, but no surprise here, over the mesocycles, over the meso itself, and over the training block, fatigue rises over the weeks and weeks and weeks. Period. At first, your raw stimulus magnitude is pretty stable because novelty is a good thing, but it can be too much of a good thing where you're so novel, you can't even, so a new exercise, you haven't even learned how to recruit your fastest twitch motor units because it's so unstable and weird for you. As you get more practice of it, weeks and weeks and weeks, you can recruit it more, which is why you see strength go up real fast in the first couple of weeks. Your nervous system, they say, your nervous system learns to use it better. That's another way of saying it gets more juice out of that muscle, which is another way of saying your raw stimulus magnitude goes up. So the first mesocycle might be really good raw stimulus magnitude. Your second might be even better, but your third starts to get worse because of that staleness as fatigue decreases your pumps, your mind muscle, metabolite, and so on and so forth, right? So fatigue goes up exponentially, especially with every mesocycle, especially for joint and connective tissue component of fatigue. So deloads, huge big picture point. Deloads are critical to resetting SFRs. If you don't deload, can you still make gains that next week? Probably, but your stimulus is going to be like that and your fatigue is going to be like that. It's just stupid. Take a deload so your stimulus starts to be like this and your fatigue starts to be like that and you can rerun the program again, right? And then low volume and active rest phases between blocks or within blocks before your next training block of 3 or 4 mesos at a time, probably a really good idea for resetting your SFR. Fundamentally, we have a conundrum here, right? Here's some really cool sort of mathematical implication. Your SFR falls every single week that you're training in an accumulation. But if you take a deload, it's you have terrible SFR because the stimulus of a deload is effectively zero. It's the worst possible thing. But as you do that week, your SFR potential goes back up, and then you do it again. So it's kind of like, your race car analogy happens to be the perfect analogy. There's analogous on every single front. It's the pit stop analogy. Think of deloads like pit stops, right? If you take a pit stop, do you lose laps? Fuck yeah, the other guys are doing this and you're fucking sitting there. It's awful. But your SFR, so to speak, your ability to keep doing good laps is rising the entire time. Like every bolt they tighten, your ability to do laps goes up. So it's not time wasted, it's time used. So another way to ask the question of how often should I deload is, what's going to give you another mesocycle of good results? Is it taking a week to reset? Or is it not taking a week and just going another week to keep going, right? So when people ask a lot of times, hey, how do I go from doing a 4-week accumulation to a 5-week accumulation? Another way to ask it is, how do I get this much extra gain, using a whole fucking week to do that, by the way, this much fatigue, where I could just deload, get no gains, but fatigue goes down, and then restart a meso where I get this much gain, but this much fatigue. So is it good idea to think about, how do I stop having 2 mesocycle accumulations, 2-week accumulations, which is awful, and go to 3 and 4? That's worth the trade-off. That's worth the pit stop, right? That's like going around, you've been doing 2 laps and you need to pit. We need to change something so you can do like 50 laps in pit. But if you're doing 50 laps in pitting, ask yourself, how do I do 75 laps in pitting? You'll have to admit that that means the laps 50 through 75, those last 25 laps suck. You don't want to do that. You just want to pit. So that sort of plays out. The deload isn't just to get rid of the fatigue and so on and so forth. It's to reset your SFRs higher. The deload should prepare you for another couple of weeks of awesome training, which means there's a balance there. And for most people, it occurs around 4 to 6 weeks. So, big picture, you have to train to get a given raw stimulus magnitude. It's fundamentally the reason you come to the gym is to stimulate muscle growth. Fatigue is a byproduct. It should be discussed as such. But fundamentally, you're getting the gym to get some amount of muscle. You have to do whatever inputs it takes to get that amount of muscle, frequency, volume, etc. And some of those are not for the best SFRs. They're just not. So you won't be able to get your best SFR, so don't worry about it too much. I wouldn't say don't worry at all, right? Worrying is not productive. Don't even concern yourself a ton with it. Know that it's there within what you have to do. Like, we have to do a 500 lap race, so we're going to have to pit 3 times. So what would be the ideal number of pit stops from an SFR perspective? Let's say it's 1, it's not 3. But that would be 1 if you raced 150 miles, not 500. So you have a certain amount of training to do. So some SFRs are chopped off for you automatically. Get the best SFRs you can by considering all this stuff, and then go from there. Folks, that was a meaty. We'll see you next time for lecture number 14. Peace.